It begins with a picture. Sepia-toned, its edges softened by the passage of a century and a half. Two girls, seated side by side, stare into the lens with that peculiar, fixed solemnity common to early photographs. They are identical in every visible feature, the same delicate oval of the face, the same pale curls pinned neatly at the ears, the same slight arch to the brows. Yet anyone looking at it, even without knowing the story, feels the wrongness immediately. One girl is unmistakably 17. Her posture is poised, her dress a tailored confection of silk and lace, the high collar closing around the graceful line of her neck. The other is not. She wears a simpler frock, child-sized, hem falling just below the knees. Her legs do not reach the floor. Her hands, small and unsure, are folded tightly in her lap. Her face is smooth with the soft, untested innocence of 10 years old. Both are the same person. Both, the same age, at least, they were meant to be. This photograph, taken in the spring of 1871, is the first surviving record of the Caraway twins. It is also the most troubling. In the decades that followed, the image would pass from family hands into whispered local legend, into dusty drawers of collectors, and finally into the possession of an amateur historian, who kept it behind glass on the wall of his study. Visitors would stand before it, saying nothing at first, and then, almost inevitably, they would lean closer to study the younger girl's expression. At first glance, her face is calm. But stay with it long enough, and it begins to change. The eyes seem wider than they should be, as though startled at the moment of the shutter's click. There is a faint crease between the brows, the shadow of a thought she cannot name. And her mouth, set in a line that is neither frown nor smile, seems to press down on some unspoken protest. The elder twin, in contrast, wears the faintest suggestion of a smirk. It is not mockery, nor arrogance, but the quiet confidence of someone who has already stepped forward into the world, leaving her sibling behind. In the photograph's lower corner, almost lost in the mottled backdrop, is the imprint of the photographer's name, J. Cartwright, Madison, Georgia. His ledger for that year still exists in the archives of a regional museum. In his neat, looping script, the entry for March 14th reads, Caraway, family portrait, 2 daughters, identical, yet singular. The final 2 words, underlined twice, are unlike any of his other notes, and scholars have debated whether they reveal his awareness of the strange circumstance, or simply an artist's flourish. To understand the significance of the photograph, one must recall the time. In 1871, photography was still a rare indulgence in rural Georgia. Exposure times were long, requiring subjects to remain perfectly still for as much as half a minute. Children, restless by nature, often blurred at the edges or shifted their gaze. Yet in this image, the younger twin is motionless, almost rigid, her gaze fixed not quite on the camera, but through it. The plate negative, preserved longer than anyone expected, reveals details lost in the paper print. There, under magnification, one can see a faint reflection in her eyes, not of the photographer's face, but of a window behind him, framing the pale outline of a bare magnolia tree. Whether this is mere coincidence or some symbolic omen has been left to interpretation. What is certain is that the photograph marked a point of no return for the Caraway family. In the weeks following its sitting, rumors began to stir among the townsfolk. A few had already noticed the girls' difference in age, or rather, in apparent age, when they were seen together at church or walking along the main road. But the photograph, once shown to neighbors, made it undeniable. Some claimed the younger was ill, perhaps stricken with some wasting disease that kept her from growing. Others whispered that she was not truly a twin at all, but a younger sister adopted to replace a dead child, an accusation both cruel and unfounded. Still others, especially among the older generation, recalled tales of frozen children, spirits caught between years, their bodies refusing the march of time. The Caraways themselves said nothing. The father, a man of some political influence, dismissed any inquiries with a polite but final nod. The mother, who rarely appeared in public after that spring, was seen once in the milliner's shop purchasing 2 identical hats, one in a lady's size, the other in a child's. As for the photographer, Cartwright, he would later remark, in a letter to a colleague in Savannah, that he had never felt such palpable stillness in his studio as he did that day. Not silence, he clarified, but stillness, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The photograph remains the most accessible evidence of the twins' existence, and for many, it is enough. But to those who know the full story, or claim to, it is merely the first breadcrumb on a path that winds through tragedy, science, superstition, and a lingering unease that no century can quite erase. And so, when the image is shown today, in lectures, in local museums, or passed quietly from hand to hand at historical gatherings, it elicits the same sequence of reactions. First, curiosity, the novelty of twin girls in the Reconstruction South. Then, confusion, the undeniable difference in age between the two. Finally, the pause, that lingering, unsettled pause, when the viewer realizes they are looking at something that, in all the comforting logic of the world, should not exist. That is where our story begins, with a photograph, two identical girls, and the mystery of why one seemed destined to walk into the future, while the other remained in a year she could never leave. Madison, Georgia, in 1871, was a place caught between centuries. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, but its shadow lay long over the streets. Much of the town's wealth had been stripped away, but its grand houses, spared from destruction by a combination of Union strategy and local negotiation, still stood in dignified rows along the oak-lined avenues. The facades were brightened with new paint, yet behind the shutters, life moved cautiously, as if the residents feared time itself might bring more ruin if they hurried it along. The rhythms of the town were measured not in the new schedules of industry, but by two familiar keepers of time. On the courthouse green stood the great iron clock, its white face visible from nearly every main road, tolling the hours with a deep, authoritative chime. Across town, the church bell answered, a warmer, more human note that seemed to wrap itself around Sunday mornings and wedding processions. To the people of Madison, these two clocks were more than instruments, they were anchors, keeping the present tethered to the past. The Caraway estate lay at the edge of this ordered world, beyond a rise where the road bent toward the river. It was a white-pillared house built before the war, surrounded by lawns that sloped down into a grove of pecan trees. The shutters were always closed in the heat of the afternoon, and in the evenings, only a few windows showed lamplight. Though the Caraways were considered prominent, old money, old land, they were not often seen in the daily bustle. They did not linger on porches for idle talk, nor attend gatherings in the same easy manner as their peers. To the townsfolk, this reserve was part of the family's character. The father, Jonathan Caraway, was a lawyer by training and a man known for measured words. He had once served as a delegate in the state legislature and still kept correspondence with colleagues in Atlanta. The mother, Eliza, came from a lineage of planters, her maiden name opening doors in certain circles. Their home was maintained with care, but never an ostentatious display. There was a sense that the family preferred to look inward rather than outward. In a town where news spread more swiftly by conversation than by paper, the Caraways' privacy made them a puzzle. Some admired it as dignity. Others, quietly, called it distance. But all agreed on one point: the family's children were rarely allowed into the casual company of others. When the twins were younger, they were seen walking the garden paths, their hands linked, dressed alike in pale frocks with ribbons in their hair. Yet even then, the sightings were brief, a flash of white through the pecan trees, a glimpse of curls in the carriage window as it rolled past the square. The town itself was a place where change was slow, and even the smallest difference could ripple like a stone dropped into still water. The return of the Caraway twins to public view in 1871, for the purpose of a formal portrait, was therefore no small event. Though the sitting itself was private, word of it reached the mercantile counters and the church pews within a day. There was talk of how the family had kept so much to themselves in recent years, and why they might now wish to be recorded in such a public manner. To understand how unusual this was, one must recall the mood of Madison in the early Reconstruction years. There was an almost superstitious reverence for appearances. The war had broken many families, both in fortune and in number, and there was a collective determination to restore what could be restored: houses, reputations, lineages. In such an environment, the Carraways' decision to bring their daughters into the photographic studio was interpreted as a signal. Perhaps the girls were to be reintroduced, to take their place in society as the next generation of a respected name. And yet, when the photograph emerged, it carried with it something the town could not quite reconcile. Here were the twins, yes, identical in every feature, but altered in ways that defied the natural march of years. One, a young woman ready for courtship and the responsibilities of her class. The other, still a child in every visible measure. In the weeks that followed, the image became an unspoken test among neighbors. Some claimed they saw nothing unusual, while others lowered their voices, unwilling to say aloud what they truly thought. Madison was a place that preferred its mysteries wrapped in decorum. Outright scandal was rare, for it was considered a breach of manners to name such things plainly. Instead, questions were phrased as observations: the Carraway girls have grown differently, haven't they? Or, perhaps the younger has been unwell. In the space between politeness and truth, rumor found fertile ground. There was, too, an undercurrent of something older than Reconstruction propriety, the kind of half-forgotten folklore that clung to southern towns in those years. Stories of families touched by strange fortune or misfortune, of children marked by forces beyond the doctor's reach. In the evenings, on shaded verandas, some elders would speak of such cases with the same tone they used for ghost tales, not entirely believed, but never entirely dismissed. The Carraways, for their part, did nothing to confirm or dispel these murmurs. The father continued his legal work, traveling occasionally to nearby counties. The mother withdrew further from public life, seen only in the company of her daughters on rare trips to the dressmaker. From the road, passers-by noted that the curtains in the upper rooms were drawn nearly all the time, as though the house itself were shielding its inhabitants from view. Madison's 2 clocks kept tolling the hours, steady and untroubled, their hands moving in agreement. But for the Carraway family, and for the twins at the heart of their guarded world, time was no longer a shared experience. In one house, behind those closed shutters, it was already beginning to divide. It was the summer of 1864, and war was drawing closer to Madison than it had ever been. The rail lines to the north were severed, and soldiers, weary, dust-covered, carrying the sharp scent of gunpowder, sometimes passed along the main road. The Carraway twins were 10 years old that June, too young to grasp the full gravity of the conflict, though old enough to notice the worried glances exchanged between adults. On the morning of their birthday, the air was already heavy with heat. The Carraway lawn shimmered in the sunlight, the scent of blooming magnolias mixing with the faint acrid drift of smoke from distant skirmishes. Servants moved quietly, setting a small table in the garden with a cake their mother had ordered, a rare indulgence in a year when sugar was scarce. The twins, dressed alike in pale muslin, chased each other along the path between the pecan trees. They had invented a game of blindfold chase, taking turns with a length of blue ribbon tied over their eyes. Their laughter rose and fell in bursts, cutting briefly through the somber stillness that hung over the town. It was while the younger twin wore the blindfold that the sky changed. Witnesses later described it as if a shadow had passed over the sun, though there were no clouds. The air thickened, the stillness so sudden that the rustling leaves froze mid-whisper. A low rumble sounded, not quite thunder, but something denser, closer. Then, the lightning. It struck somewhere just beyond the grove, so near that the flash seemed to engulf the entire garden. The crack of it was deafening, a single note of violence that rattled the glass in the upstairs windows. The smell of scorched earth and singed leaves flooded the air. When the light faded, one of the twins was lying in the grass. Not the elder, but the younger, her blindfold half loosened, her hands curled against her chest. She was breathing, though unsteadily, her face pale under the crown of golden curls. The elder knelt beside her, calling her name again and again, while a servant ran for their mother. They carried her inside, and for hours she lay on the chaise in the drawing room, her eyes closed, her skin cool. No burn marks, no injuries, no sign of trauma, and yet, something had changed. When she awoke near nightfall, she asked the same question 3 times in a row: "Is it still my birthday?" The family physician, summoned in haste, examined her by lamplight. He found her pulse slow but steady, her pupils responsive. His conclusion, delivered in the clipped language of a man who had no answer, was that she had been shocked by proximity to the strike. Rest, he said, would restore her. Rest did restore her, in part. Within days she was back on her feet, speaking, laughing, and following her sister about the garden. But to those closest to her, there was an oddness, a faint delay in her responses, as though she were listening to some other conversation far away. Weeks passed, and the war crept closer still. The town endured shortages and the dull, constant dread of what might happen should the fighting reach their streets. The twins remained within the caraway grounds, their days quiet, their games subdued. And yet, by the time the year turned, another difference had begun to emerge. The elder was growing taller, her face sharpening into the beginnings of young womanhood. The younger, the one struck down that summer afternoon, remained exactly as she had been at 10. Not merely small for her age, but entirely unchanged, the same roundness of cheek, the same childish hand, the same narrow shoulders beneath her frock. Neighbors noticed. At first it was subtle, a remark about how the younger one stays little, or perhaps she's a late bloomer. But by the following spring, when the elder's dresses were being let out for length and the younger's still fit without alteration, the difference was impossible to ignore. The family, as ever, offered no explanation. They did not consult further physicians. They did not send her away for treatment. Life in the Caraway house seemed to resume its careful rhythm, though servants whispered in the kitchen that the younger twin was often found sitting for long stretches in the same chair, staring at the garden as though waiting for something to change. There was one more detail from that summer, a detail rarely spoken aloud, even years later. The day after the lightning strike, the elder twin told a cousin that her sister's shadow had looked wrong in the garden that afternoon. Too small, she said, for the way the light was falling. When asked what she meant, she could only shake her head, as if the memory itself made no sense even to her. Whether the strike marked the moment her time stopped, or whether it was merely the first sign of something stranger, no one could say. What the people of Madison did know, or believed they knew, was that from that day onward, the Caraway twins no longer walked in step. One would keep pace with the town's slow march toward the future. The other would remain behind, held in the strange stillness of that summer afternoon, the day the sky flashed and time itself seemed to falter. By the late months of 1865, the war had ended, and Madison was piecing itself back together with the quiet stubbornness of a place that refused to disappear. The Caraway estate remained intact, its white columns clean and its grounds neatly trimmed, as though the chaos of the nation had passed it by. Yet inside, something unspoken had taken root, a secret too large to be contained by walls, and too strange to be shared aloud. At first, the difference in the twins was easy to overlook. A year after the lightning strike, the elder wore dresses cut for a young lady, her hair pinned in the simple coils expected of her age. The younger still wore the same pale frocks of a child, her curls tied back with ribbons. In public, they still walked hand in hand, a gesture that to the casual observer might have seemed charming. But those who knew the family well began to sense that it was the elder who held the child's hand, firmly, as if guiding her forward, rather than the other way around. The Caraways did not court attention. They attended church regularly, sitting in their usual pew near the front. They nodded politely to acquaintances on the main street. But they did not linger for conversation. If someone asked about the girls, the father's answer was always the same: "They are well." It was a sentence that both ended and avoided the subject in a single breath. Servants in the household were more candid, though only in the privacy of the kitchen or the market stalls. They spoke of odd habits that had taken hold in the years after the strike. Mirrors in the upstairs rooms were often covered with cloth, even when no one was ill. A certain bedroom door, always the same one, was kept locked at night. Meals were sometimes sent up to the attic, only to return untouched hours later. One maid claimed she had once found the younger twin in the garden at dawn, sitting on the grass in her nightdress, staring toward the pecan grove. When asked what she was doing, the girl replied, waiting for the day to change. The maid said she laughed nervously at the answer, but that something in the child's voice, calm, assured, almost adult, had unsettled her for the rest of the morning. It was not long before the town began to notice the Carraways' increasing seclusion. In a place where neighbors measured the passing years by weddings, births, and the height of children against doorframes, the younger twins' unchanging form became a silent challenge to the natural order. Mothers who once encouraged their daughters to play with the Carraway girls now hesitated. The difference between them was no longer a small thing, it was a gulf. And so the whispers began. At first, they were gentle speculations. Perhaps the child was recovering from a long illness, perhaps she had been born with some delicate condition the family wished to protect her from. But as months passed without change, the explanations grew darker. Some recalled the lightning strike and said it had stolen more than her strength. Others reached for older stories, the kind passed down in quiet corners of porches on summer nights, about children caught between this world and the next, unable to grow until some unseen debt was paid. The Reverend, a careful man who avoided superstition, chose his words cautiously when parishioners asked. "God's work is not always visible to us," he would say, and leave it there. But even he could not entirely keep from glancing toward the Carraway pew when the younger twin bowed her head in prayer. Inside the Carraway home, the family's routines tightened. The girls were rarely seen apart, but it was the elder who spoke when spoken to, the elder who fetched things from the kitchen or carried messages to the gate. The younger seemed content to linger in shadowed rooms, her bare feet silent on the carpeted halls. On more than one occasion, visitors remarked, never to the family directly, that they had passed a doorway and seen her watching them from within, her expression unreadable. By 1868, 3 full years after the strike, the town's whispers had settled into a kind of rhythm, just as the tolling of the courthouse clock marked the hours. The younger twin had not grown. She had not changed in voice, in manner, or in height. The elder, now verging on womanhood, wore the fashions of the day and began to draw notice from the sons of other prominent families. It was an image that stirred unease, 2 sisters, the same face repeated, yet one a child and the other nearly grown, as if time had chosen sides. From behind the closed shutters of the Carraway estate, the truth, if there was such a thing, remained theirs alone. But outside, in the lanes and shops of Madison, the whispers took on a life of their own. They moved softly from mouth to mouth, lingering in the spaces between politeness, until they became not just gossip, but part of the town's unspoken history. And with each year that passed, the younger twin seemed less like a girl who might one day catch up, and more like a figure fixed in place, a living reminder that not all clocks, even in Madison, kept the same time. In the spring of 1869, the Carraway family broke their long pattern of avoiding outside inquiry. Whether prompted by a growing sense of alarm or by the increasing boldness of the town's whispers, they summoned a physician of some reputation from Savannah. His name was Dr. Alastair Greaves, a tall, spare man in his 50s, whose gray beard and sharply pressed coat lent him the air of a figure cut from medical engravings. Dr. Greaves had studied in London in his youth, returning to Georgia with a confidence that he could bridge the gap between European science and Southern practice. He was known for his precise handwriting, his meticulous records, and his refusal to indulge in superstition. In the letters that survive from his career, one can see a man determined to drag medicine out of the fog of folk cures and into the clear light of reason. When he arrived at the Carraway estate, it was a cool morning. The garden smelled faintly of damp earth from the previous night's rain. He was shown into the drawing room, where the elder twin sat quietly with her mother, both rising as he entered. Only when the younger sister appeared, small, light-footed, with her hands clasped in front of her, did Greaves' demeanor change. In his later notes, now kept in a private collection, he wrote, "The likeness between them is exact in feature and form, save for the elder's maturity of frame. The younger's physiognomy and stature are identical to a girl of perhaps 9 years, though I am assured both are approaching 15. The examination began in a guest bedroom with tall windows overlooking the lawn. Greaves' methods were thorough, for the time. He measured her height and weight, examined the eyes, teeth, and hair, and took her pulse at intervals while she rested and while she stood. He questioned her about her appetite, her sleep, her memory of past events. Physically, she was sound. No wasting of muscle, no discoloration of the skin, no signs of injury or congenital deformity. Yet her bones, as he judged by the feel at wrist and ankle, had not lengthened in years. Arrested vitality, he called it, a phrase that would later trouble him, for it seemed too close to an admission that life itself had been caught and held still. Over the course of a week, he attempted several treatments. These included tonic baths infused with rosemary and camphor, intended to stir the humors, a regimen of beef broth and fortified wines to stimulate growth, and, most controversially, the use of a small galvanic device to pass electric currents through the muscles. The girl endured these sessions without complaint, though her expression remained calm to the point of detachment, as if she understood the attempts would come to nothing. The elder twin watched most of the procedures in silence, her presence a constant shadow in the room. Once, when the younger flinched at the touch of cold metal, the elder reached for her hand, and the physician noted the speed with which the younger's breathing steadied. "Their bond," he wrote, "is of a kind I cannot quite articulate, not merely of affection, but of some necessity." By the end of the week, Greaves admitted to the Carraways that he could find no cause. His diagnosis, couched in cautious language, was that the girl suffered from cellular torpor, a speculative term implying that her very tissues had slowed in their natural renewal. He advised patience and regular nourishment, adding, almost as an afterthought, that time itself might prove the only remedy. In private correspondence to a colleague in Charleston, however, his words were less restrained. "If I did not know her to be of flesh, I would swear she were preserved, not in the crude manner of the anatomist's jar, but by some unseen force that holds her youth intact. The trouble is not that she will not grow, but that she cannot." He left Madison with his fee paid in full, a courtesy from the Carraways despite his lack of success. The family saw him to the carriage, and the younger twin stood at the gate, watching as he departed. Greaves would later recall that she did not wave, only inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging the end of an experiment whose result she had known from the beginning. His visit did little to quiet the town's murmurs. If anything, it fed them. Word traveled that a learned physician from Savannah had been unable to cure her, and to some, this was proof that the matter was beyond medicine. For others, it was confirmation that the Carraways were hiding more than they revealed. In the years that followed, Greaves' notes on the case were mentioned in medical circles as a curiosity, cited alongside reports of children who grew only in intervals, or who appeared not to age during prolonged illness. Yet none matched the Carraway case in its completeness, the total, unwavering stillness of time's effect. For the family, the physician's failure marked a turning point. They would never again seek another outside opinion. Whatever had happened to the younger twin was no longer treated as a condition to be cured, but as a fact to be lived with, quietly, behind the closed shutters of the white-pillared house at the edge of town. By the summer of 1871, the Carraway estate had grown quieter still. The garden paths were choked with creeping ivy, the shutters remained drawn even in warm weather, and the family's appearances in town had become rare enough to be remarked upon each time they occurred. Yet for all their withdrawal, one figure did manage to cross their threshold, Reverend Josiah Phelps. Phelps was a man of solemn bearing, his narrow face framed by a thatch of pale hair that the sun had already begun to thin. He had arrived in Madison only a year before, taking up the pulpit at the First Baptist Church after the death of its long-serving minister. To his parishioners, he was a comfort, steady in his sermons, temperate in his judgment. But those who knew him in closer company spoke of a certain restlessness in his manner, a tendency to fix his gaze on a person as if measuring some invisible weight they carried. The Reverend's initial visits to the Carraways were pastoral in nature, brief, polite calls to inquire after their health and to offer prayer. The elder Mrs. Carraway, herself raised in a devout household, received him with the courtesy expected of a lady of her station. The twins, however, were seldom present for these early meetings. Only after several months did the Reverend catch sight of the younger, and it was this moment, by all later accounts, that shifted the tenor of his interest. He had been invited to take tea in the shaded veranda, where the air was heavy with the scent of magnolia. As he sipped from a porcelain cup, the younger twin appeared from the hallway beyond, moving with an unhurried grace. She greeted him with a quiet, "Good afternoon," and seated herself beside her sister. It was a brief exchange, yet long enough for Phelps to note what so many before him had, that her face, her frame, even the softness of her voice belonged to a child far younger than her years. In the weeks following, the Reverend began to call more frequently, sometimes unannounced. His conversations turned, with practiced subtlety, toward the subject of spiritual afflictions, of trials permitted by God for purposes not always known to man. He spoke of biblical accounts in which time and flesh were touched by forces beyond earthly reckoning, Sarah bearing Isaac in her old age, the preservation of Moses upon the waters, the raising of Jairus' daughter. The elder Mrs. Carroway listened with polite reserve, but the younger twin seemed unmoved, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond his shoulder, as though his words reached her ears but did not take root. One visit, however, marked a change. It was late afternoon, the sky low and swollen with the promise of rain. Phelps arrived carrying a small, leather-bound volume, a family Bible, well worn, its pages foxed with age. He asked permission to read aloud, and choosing from the Gospel of John, he spoke the account of Lazarus, the waiting, the weeping, and at last, the command, "Come forth." When he closed the book, there was a silence that stretched uncomfortably. Then the Reverend leaned forward slightly, addressing the younger twin directly. "There are bargains, child, which heaven will honor, if they are made in faith." His tone was even, but there was a weight in it, a careful emphasis that made the words feel more like a proposal than a sermon. What he meant by bargain was never made plain. Some later claimed he intended a covenant, that if she, or her family, surrendered some earthly possession or promise, God might release her from her strange condition. Others believed he spoke of his own intercession, an offer to take her case to the Lord in exchange for an undisclosed pledge. The Carroways, whatever their private thoughts, did not dismiss him outright. Over the following month, Phelps returned with increasing regularity, sometimes remaining for hours behind the closed doors of the drawing room. No one outside the household ever heard the words spoken there, but afterward, the Reverend's sermons in town grew more fervent, almost desperate, as if he preached not only to his congregation but to an unseen listener far beyond their pews. It is recorded that during this period, Phelps was seen late at night in the church, kneeling alone at the altar, the single lamp casting his shadow high upon the wall. A caretaker later claimed to have heard him speaking, not praying in the usual cadence, but speaking as one might to another person standing in the darkness. Then, quite suddenly, the visit stopped. Weeks passed without sight of the Reverend at the Carroway gates. Inquiries in town were met with evasions. The Reverend has been occupied with church matters. Only much later did it come to light that he had been confined to his rooms for a time, stricken with an illness that left him pale and unsteady on his feet. When he returned to the pulpit, he was noticeably altered, thinner, quieter, and given to long pauses during his sermons, as though listening for something that did not come. What passed between him and the Carroways remains unknown. Yet from that summer onward, the younger twin was seen even less frequently, her appearances in public reduced to rare glimpses from a carriage window or across the churchyard. The Reverend, for his part, never again spoke of bargains in his preaching. Some said he had attempted to make one, and failed. Others whispered that he had succeeded, but at a price he had not foreseen. Whatever the truth, the bond between the Carroway household and Reverend Phelps was never entirely severed. He would be present at certain family occasions, always in the background, his gaze drawn, as it had been from the first, to the girl who did not grow. By the autumn of 1874, much in Madison had changed. New storefronts lined the main street, the railway brought a steadier flow of visitors, and the air seemed perpetually scented with coal smoke from the engines that passed daily. Yet for one man, returning after years away, the place carried a weight of memory, and of something left unresolved. Samuel Hargrove stepped off the train with his camera case in one hand and his hat brim pulled low against the afternoon glare. In the years since he had left, his work as an itinerant photographer had taken him across half the eastern states, capturing soldiers' portraits, new brides in their lace, and the solemn gatherings of bereaved families. But it was a single image, taken here in Madison, that had stayed with him more than any other, the portrait of the Caraway twins, the elder poised with an air of maturity, the younger frozen in a childhood she could not seem to outgrow. Hargrove had not meant to return. But fate, or perhaps something less easily named, had guided his steps. The commission that brought him here, a series of photographs for the town's expanding mercantile association, would take only a week to complete. Still, as he walked the familiar streets, his thoughts turned inevitably toward the Caraway estate. On his second evening in town, he found himself standing at its gates. The ironwork was flecked with rust, the gravel drive littered with the season's first fallen leaves. Through the tangle of hedges, the house loomed much as he remembered it, broad and pale, with its high windows shuttered against the fading light. He hesitated only a moment before lifting the latch. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots was loud in the stillness. Approaching the front steps, he raised his hand to knock, and the door opened before he could touch it. It was the elder twin who greeted him. Time had etched faint lines around her eyes, and her manner was more reserved than he recalled. She recognized him at once, and though her expression was cautious, she invited him inside. The parlor was dim, its curtains drawn, dust motes drifted in the narrow bands of light that escaped between the fabric folds. They spoke politely at first. He inquired after her mother, learning that she had passed the previous winter. She asked after his work, nodding at the mention of cities whose names carried a distant glamour. Then, after a pause, Hargrove ventured the question that had pressed upon him since his arrival. "And your sister? Is she well?" The elder twin's gaze flickered, a momentary shift, quick as the twitch of a candle flame. "She is, as she has always been," she replied. The words were measured, careful. As if on cue, a door at the far end of the room opened, and there she was. The younger twin stepped forward, her hair in the same loose braid he remembered, her frame still slight, her eyes wide with that same unplaceable depth. 9 years had passed since he had first seen her, yet she appeared unchanged, no taller, no older, the same as in his glass plate. Hargrove rose to greet her, but something in her manner gave him pause. She moved with deliberate slowness, each step noiseless on the carpet, and when she extended her hand, it was cool, almost cold, to the touch. Her smile was polite but faint, as though she wore it for his sake alone. They spoke briefly, pleasantries, nothing more, before she excused herself, disappearing once more beyond the door. In her absence, the elder twin poured him tea, her hand steady despite the tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface of her composure. Hargrove hesitated, then opened his camera case. "I wonder," he said, "if she might allow me to take another photograph. For my own record, if nothing else." The elder twin's expression darkened, though her voice remained calm. "I think not, Mr. Hargrove. We have no wish to invite further curiosity." He accepted this without protest, but as he sipped his tea, he could not shake the memory of her sister's face, identical to the one in the portrait he had taken so long ago. Later that week, he made inquiries in town. Some spoke of the younger twin in hushed tones, as if reluctant to invite misfortune by naming her. A few insisted she was merely frail, sheltered by her family's overprotectiveness. But others, older residents with longer memories, claimed there was something unnatural about her constancy, a stillness that time could not touch. One evening, Hargrove returned to the estate under the pretext of delivering a print he had promised. The windows were dark except for a faint glow in one upper room. As he approached, a movement caught his eye, the younger twin, standing at the window, gazing into the night. For a moment, her eyes seemed to fix upon him, though the distance was too great to be certain. Then the curtains drew closed, swift and final. Hargrove left Madison the following morning. Yet the image of her, unchanged, watching, followed him for the rest of his days. The photograph he had taken years before remained among his belongings, kept wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his trunk. Occasionally, when the road was long and the night hours stretched silent, he would unwrap it and study her face. Always, the same thought came to him: it was not the camera that had preserved her. The Caraway estate stood empty for many years after the death of its last known occupant. No one could say precisely when the elder twin had passed. Her presence in town had grown increasingly rare, and then, one season, she was simply gone. The house remained shuttered, its pale facade weathering into a mottled gray, the once manicured garden surrendered to weeds and brambles. By the winter of 1891, the town council had declared the property abandoned. Notices were posted, though few believed any buyer would come forward. The house had earned a reputation that even the most practical of men could not quite dismiss. Stories circulated, not of loud hauntings or obvious terrors, but of subtler, stranger things: a light glimpsed in an upper window on nights when no one was meant to be there, a faint smell of lilacs drifting from the locked parlor, though the gardens had long since choked under nettles. Children dared one another to run up the gravel drive and touch the front steps, but few stayed long enough to do more than glance at the tall windows. They spoke of feeling watched, of a sudden coldness on the air. One boy claimed to have seen a pale face at the glass, but when he returned with friends, the window was dark. It was the spring thaw of 1894 when a surveyor, hired to assess the property for potential sale, forced the front doors open for the first time in over a decade. The air inside was thick, stale, yet not entirely unpleasant, as though the rooms had been sealed against the outside world's decay. Dust lay in even layers across the furniture, undisturbed, save for a narrow path where footsteps had once passed. In the dining room, the table was still set, though the silver had tarnished to a dull shadow of its former gleam. In the parlor, the curtains hung heavy, their fabric brittle to the touch. The surveyor noted these details with a sort of professional detachment, but his pace quickened as he ascended the main staircase. Upstairs, the air felt cooler. At the end of the hall, the last door on the left stood ajar, revealing a bedroom small and simply furnished. A narrow bed, neatly made. A desk with a single chair. And on the wall, directly opposite the window, a framed photograph, its glass clouded with the faint haze of age. The surveyor approached. It was a portrait of two young girls, seated side by side. Their faces were identical, yet the gaze of one was subtly different, sharper, more knowing, as though aware of being observed. He recognized the style at once, an old glassplate print from the 1860s, perhaps by one of the itinerant photographers who had passed through the region in that era. There was something else. Beneath the frame, resting on the desk, lay a second photograph. This one was unframed, its edges curled slightly with time. It depicted only one girl, the younger twin, standing at a window, her hand lifted against the pane. The photograph's quality was remarkable, the detail sharp even in shadow. But it was the date, penciled lightly on the back, that made the surveyor pause: 1889. By all accounts, the younger twin had not been seen in public for nearly 20 years by that point. And yet here she was, in an image taken long after her disappearance from town life. Her appearance in the photograph was unchanged, not merely youthful, but precisely as she had been in the earlier portrait. The surveyor, though unsettled, completed his work. The report he filed with the council made no mention of the photographs, noting only that the property was structurally sound, though in need of significant cosmetic repair. The images, it seems, vanished from record. Whether he took them, left them, or destroyed them is not known. The estate changed hands twice in the years that followed. Its new owners were ambitious enough to renovate the ground floor, but each abandoned the project before completion. One cited financial hardship, another left without explanation, the house locked and the keys mailed back to the council office with no accompanying letter. By the turn of the century, the property was considered more trouble than it was worth. The house was finally sold to a distant relative of the Caraway family, who, according to town records, never lived there. For decades it stood, silent and empty, until a lightning storm in the summer of 1921 sparked a fire that consumed the upper floors. What remained was left to the elements, the walls crumbling into the overgrowth. Today, little survives beyond the outline of the foundations and the rusted hinge of the front gate. The photographs are gone, perhaps lost to fire, perhaps hidden away in some attic where their subjects still gaze with that same unfathomable stillness. Those who remember the old stories speak of the younger twin as if she were more a figure of legend than of fact. They say she could be seen, now and again, in the years after the house was first abandoned, standing in the upper window on nights when the moon was high. Always the same, hair in a loose braid, face lit pale against the dark. Watching. If she was ever more than a ghost of memory, time has done nothing to change her. In the spring of 1932, more than a decade after the Caraway house had burned, a man named Henry Keats arrived in the nearby town of Unsolved. Keats was a traveling salesman of photographic equipment, cameras, plates, and the new roll films that were beginning to replace older methods. He was known for his sharp eye and a habit of lingering in small towns longer than his business strictly required, always looking for unusual subjects to capture on film. One afternoon, while walking the countryside in search of landscapes to photograph, Keats came across a narrow dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Curiosity led him on. The air was cool for the season, with a mist clinging low over the fields. After some distance, he saw, through the haze, the remnants of what appeared to have once been a grand estate. The gates were long gone, the stone posts half buried in grass. The house itself was a ruin, a hollow shell of charred beams and collapsed walls, with only fragments of its former elegance still visible in the surviving masonry. Keats found the scene striking, a perfect composition of decay and solitude. He set up his tripod to capture it. As he worked, movement in the upper shadows of the ruin caught his eye. He lowered the camera, scanning the broken frame of what had once been the second floor. There, just for a moment, he thought he saw a figure, a woman, standing where no floor should have been, her face pale and indistinct in the shifting light. She was gone in an instant. Keats, assuming he had imagined it, resumed his work, but the impression stayed with him. That evening, in the small room he rented above the general store, he developed the plate. The image was as he had expected, the ruin, the gnarled trees beyond, but in one window frame, faint yet undeniable, a human figure could be seen. The detail was astonishing given the distance. The figure appeared to be a young woman, her features softened by shadow, her hair drawn back in a loose braid. She wore what looked like a dress from decades past, high-necked and plain. The effect was not ghostly in the usual sense, there was no blur, no distortion, only the inexplicable presence of someone who could not possibly have been there. Keats was intrigued, and perhaps sensing an opportunity for a story to accompany his photograph, he began asking questions in town. Most had no idea what he was referring to, but an older shopkeeper, on hearing his description, grew quiet. "Sounds like one of the Caraway girls," he said at last. The name meant nothing to Keats, so the shopkeeper told him what he remembered: two sisters, identical in face but different in temperament, who had lived in a great house out past the fields. One, he said, had died young, the other had become reclusive, seen only rarely until she too vanished. The house had burned years later. He added, with some hesitation, that there were those who believed the younger sister had never aged, that she had been glimpsed, unchanged, in the years after the house was abandoned. Keats listened politely, but remained skeptical. Still, the photograph was difficult to dismiss. He decided to return to the ruins the next day, hoping to find some trace of the woman, or perhaps confirm she had been a trick of the light, a quirk of exposure. The morning was clear, the mist gone. He approached the ruin cautiously, moving through the grass that had grown waist-high around the foundations. The air felt different somehow, not hostile, but expectant, as though the place were aware of his presence. He climbed the remnants of the front steps and peered inside. The interior was a tangle of stone and charred wood, open to the sky. There was no sign of anyone. Yet, as he turned to leave, he heard the faintest sound, like a soft tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. It seemed to come from above, though there was nothing left of the upper floors. He looked up. Against the bright sky, framed in the jagged outline of a ruined window, stood the same woman. This time, she was nearer, and he could see her face clearly, serene, almost expressionless, her gaze fixed not on him but on something far beyond. She did not move, did not blink. The tapping ceased. Keats raised his camera, but by the time he set the focus, the window was empty. He left quickly, his unease growing with every step back to the road. The second photograph he had hoped for never materialized. Only the first plate, developed the night before, bore witness to what he had seen, and even that, he suspected, would be dismissed by most as an odd trick of shadow. Years later, long after Keats had moved on from his itinerant trade, that photograph surfaced briefly in a collector's catalogue. It was described only as "Ruined House with Apparition, 1932, and sold to an anonymous buyer." No other images from the series are known to exist. Those in Almsford who still remember the Caraway name say the ruins were finally cleared sometime in the 1950s, the stones carted away for use in building farm walls. Yet there are a few who insist that, on certain nights, a pale figure can still be seen on the empty field where the house once stood, a young woman in a faded dress, hair in a loose braid, watching with an expression that has not changed in over 70 years. In the winter of 1971, a writer named Margaret Ellison traveled through the north of the county while researching a book on abandoned places of England. She was meticulous in her work, preferring to interview locals in person rather than rely on second-hand sources. Her attention to obscure histories often led her into forgotten villages and overgrown tracts that no one else bothered to visit. In Almsford, she heard about the Caraway ruins, though by then, the ruins themselves no longer stood. The field was empty, bordered by low stone walls and a scattering of hawthorn trees. The ground where the house had once been was sunken, as if the earth itself remembered the weight it had carried. One evening, Margaret sat with an elderly woman named Alice Farrow in a small, low-ceilinged cottage on the edge of town. Mrs. Farrow was nearly 90 and rarely spoke to strangers, but Margaret had a gift for drawing out reluctant memories. They spoke of village matters first, the changing seasons, the decline of the farms, before the conversation turned, almost naturally, to the Caraways. Mrs. Farrow said she had been a housemaid there as a young girl. She remembered the sisters vividly, Clara, the elder, quiet and dutiful, and Lydia, the younger, restless, with a gaze that could hold a person far longer than was comfortable. Lydia had a strange charm, she said, the kind that drew people in even as it unsettled them. It was Lydia who first asked her to pose for a photograph. This was in 1911, when photography was still a novelty in the countryside. Lydia had a camera of her own, a gift from a visiting relative. She insisted on taking portraits, not the stiff formal ones so common at the time, but natural ones, in the garden, by the windows, in the upper rooms with the light slanting just so. Mrs. Farrow admitted that she found it odd how Lydia always wanted the same backdrop, the largest upstairs window, the one that looked east over the fields. No matter the subject, a family member, a servant, a friend, she positioned them there, with that expanse of sky behind. And she always kept the negatives locked away, never allowing anyone else to develop them. Then, one autumn afternoon, the photographs stopped. Lydia fell ill, or so the household said, though Mrs. Farrow never saw her during those weeks. Clara carried on alone, her face drawn and pale. There were whispers in the kitchen that Lydia had died, but no funeral was ever held. When Margaret asked why she had stayed silent all those years, Mrs. Farrow looked down at her hands. "Because I've seen her since," she said softly. She described a day in 1928, long after she had left the Caraway service. She was walking the road near the old house when she saw Lydia, or someone who looked exactly like her, standing at the eastern window. The house was already partly derelict by then, the gardens choked with weeds. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge her, but there was no mistaking the face. It was not the face of a woman who had aged 17 years. It was exactly as she had last seen her in 1911. Margaret listened without interruption, her pen moving quietly across the page. When Mrs. Farrow finished, she added one more thing: she looked like she was waiting for the shutter to click. The remark stayed with Margaret. Later that night, in her small rented room, she considered the fragments she had gathered, the ruins, the photograph by Keats, the persistent sightings over decades. She began to suspect that Lydia Carroway's likeness had been captured not once, but many times, in ways the world was not meant to see. Margaret returned to London with her notes, but before she could publish her book, she died unexpectedly in the spring of 1972. The manuscript she had been working on was never completed. Among her papers, however, a single photograph was found, a black-and-white print showing the east window of the Carroway house. There, just visible in the grain, was the figure of a young woman in a high-neck dress, hair in a loose braid, staring out toward the horizon. No one knows where the photograph came from. It was not among the materials Mrs. Farrow was known to possess, and it did not match the Keats image from 1932. Some believe it may have been one of Lydia's own, passed quietly to Margaret by someone who had kept it hidden for decades. Others think Margaret took it herself, though this is difficult to reconcile with the fact that the house had already been demolished. The print now resides in a private archive, its exact location undisclosed at the request of the collector. It is rarely shown, and when it is, the figure in the window seems to shift subtly from one viewing to the next, the tilt of the head, the set of the mouth, the direction of her gaze. Whether this is a trick of the mind or something more is impossible to say. What remains certain is that the Carroway story refuses to fade. In Almsford, the old families still tell it in hushed tones, of the sisters, the fire, the photographs, and the girl in the window who has not aged in over a century. They say she is not gone, only waiting, for the right light, the right moment, the next curious soul to wander close enough for her to be caught again, forever, in the frame. In 1984, a man known only to a small circle of antiquarians purchased an unassuming box of glass photographic plates at a country estate auction in Yorkshire. He was a private collector, discreet to the point of invisibility, the kind who paid in cash and never allowed his name to appear in the catalogues of dealers. His interest was not in art for its beauty, but in images that seemed to hold an extra quality, a residue of something unrecorded by the lens, yet embedded in the final print. The plates in the box were badly labeled, some cracked, most showing ordinary scenes, family picnics, shop fronts, rural lanes. But as he held each one up to the light, the collector noticed that several bore an unfamiliar watermark on the glass, a faint, almost imperceptible embossed emblem shaped like a half-open shutter. It was not a manufacturer's mark he recognized. Two of these marked plates, when examined under magnification, unsettled him deeply. Both showed the same large, arched window, framed by crumbling stonework. And in both, there was a figure, a young woman, sharply defined against the blurred sky behind her. The more he studied the images, the more certain he became that she was not a trick of light or an artifact of the plate's age. She was there, whole and solid, in a way that felt utterly wrong for photographs so old and so degraded. The collector began tracing the origin of the plates. The auction house could only tell him they had come from the effects of a retired schoolteacher named Edwin Purcell, who had died with no close family. Among Purcell's papers was a single folded letter, dated 1936, from a man named Robert Keats, the same name linked to the infamous photograph taken 4 years earlier in Almsford. The letter made vague reference to further exposures, and to the Eastern Light, which seems to awaken her. The collector was not a man given to superstition, but he was not ignorant of the market for objects with strange histories. The combination of Keats's name, the repeated window motif, and the unsettling presence of the figure was enough to fix the matter in his mind. He began to think of her, not as a ghost, exactly, but as a subject who resisted the natural decay of images over months. He compared the figure in the plates to known photographs of the Carroway family. The resemblance to Lydia Carroway was undeniable. More disturbing was the fact that in every known image of her, from formal family portraits to candid shots, the details of her appearance never altered. The braid over her shoulder, the fall of her dress, even the shadows across her face were eerily consistent, as if each photograph had been taken within moments of the others, despite being decades apart. This consistency led him to a troubling hypothesis, that Lydia Carroway's presence in these images was not simply recorded but fixed, bound in some way to the act of being photographed. Perhaps, he speculated, the camera had not captured her so much as trapped her, keeping her likeness suspended in a state outside of time. He shared this theory only once, in a long letter to a fellow collector of curious visual phenomena. That letter, later leaked to a small paranormal journal, spoke of a subject who inhabits the emulsion, responsive to the angle of light and the observer's distance, as though she is not frozen in a moment but awaiting the next one. There were, according to the collector, accounts from those who had viewed the plates in person. Several claimed that, upon repeated examinations, Lydia's posture shifted slightly, her gaze tracking the position of the viewer. Others said that when the plates were exposed to daylight for too long, a faint reflection appeared in the room, not in the glass itself, but somewhere just beyond it, as though the photograph were a doorway standing ajar. He was careful never to display the plates publicly. He kept them in a locked cabinet in a climate-controlled room, visited rarely and only in the presence of trusted colleagues. Still, he admitted in private correspondence that he sometimes felt the pressure of another presence in that room, a stillness that was not his own, a weight in the air that seemed to gather near the cabinet's glass door. In 1992, the collector abruptly withdrew from the antiquarian world. He sold much of his library, closed his correspondence, and moved to an undisclosed location. The plates were not among the items sold. Their whereabouts are now unknown, though rumors persist that they remain in his possession, kept in perfect darkness to prevent further agitation of the subject, as he once put it. What endures is the theory itself, one that has found its way into niche circles of researchers and photographers. They speak of the Carroway figure not as a ghost but as a photographic constant, an anomaly in the chemical process that defies the ordinary decay of images. Skeptics dismiss it as the result of overactive imagination, faulty memory, or the human tendency to impose pattern on randomness. Yet even among the skeptics, there is unease when the plates are mentioned. For if the collector was correct, if Lydia Carroway is not merely recorded but held within the image, then every reproduction, every copy, every digital scan could, in some sense, be her as well. And if she truly is waiting for the next moment, then perhaps, for someone, somewhere, the shutter has yet to finish closing.